wherever you look on the surface of the Earth, or indeed below the Earth, or way up in the atmosphere, you're going to find bacteria and viruses. Bacteria and viruses are absolutely everywhere. Look at any surface with enough magnification and you will see bacteria on it. The whole surface of the Earth is just covered with them. And yet, just a very short distance under the layer of the skin, under the surface of the skin, in the dermis, it's sterile. There are no bacteria in the inside of the body. Well, that's not entirely true if you count the gut as the inside of the body, because obviously the gut contains lots of bacteria. But between the gut and the skin, all the tissues of the body are completely sterile. Now, if they're not sterile, if there are bacteria or viruses growing in a tissue, we would call this infection. So infection is the presence of microorganisms in a tissue, and that can cause localized infection and it can cause systemic infection, clearly an abnormal situation. So there's bacteria absolutely everywhere, but how come people aren't sick most of the time? Well, this is because the body possesses immunity. And immunity is the ability to resist infections and the ability to get rid of infections should they occur. But just before we go on and look at immunity and infections, let's just think a little bit about the problem of infectious disease. Now, you've all had infections, you've all had viral and bacterial infections, and they make you sick for a period of time. And hopefully, well obviously because you listen to this podcast, you've recovered from them. But throughout human history, I think it's fair to say that the most common cause of death has been infectious disease. And if you look back at the history of the United Kingdom, for example, you see periods of time where the death rate was very high and others where the death rate was very low. And the reason for this is outbreaks of infectious disease. It was death that separated children from parents and separated loved ones, often at a very young age, because of infectious disease. And there's a lot of examples of this. I put a few in my White Physiology book, actually. If you look on page 346, there's a few. I've mentioned here that the Bible describes the plague of Ashod, currently where the modern-day Gaza Strip is, about 1100 BC. Probably many thousands of people were killed. You know, ancient documented plagues and outbreak of infectious disease. The Black Death was quite famous in the United Kingdom. In England, in the 14th century, in the 1300s, it killed an estimated 100,000 people, and of course there weren't that many people around in those days. Bubonic plague, the famous Great Plagues of 1665 in England, killed 68,000 people in London alone. Cholera epidemics in the 1850s in London killed thousands of people due to waterborne disease. And then when there's been migrations of people to other parts of the world, endogenous people often lack immunity. And when they come across new diseases, there's no immunity, and the death rates could be very high. So, for example, the endogenous population of Mexico, it's estimated, fell from 30 million to 1.6 million due to disease introduced by the European invaders, and the people had no immunity to that. Another really famous outbreak was the Influenza Pandemic of 1918-1919 at the end of the First World War. Now, this was a form of pandemic influenza, and really no one's too sure how many people it killed. Probably in excess of 20 million people, probably in excess of 40 million people. And indeed you do see estimates up to 60 million people killed in that single influenza epidemic. And actually, if you look around graveyards now in England, you'll see that in 1919 a lot of young people died because this condition affected young people actually more than it affected older people. Smallpox was estimated to kill 300 million people in the 20th century. Just incredible. And in many poor areas of the world, most deaths are still caused by infectious disease, and children are particularly prone to this. Children under the age of 5. The most common cause of death in young children is still diarrhea and vomiting, simple viral and bacterial gastroenteritis. And malaria, of course, is still a complete scourge on humanity. 3,000 children died of malaria in Africa yesterday. 3,000 children died today of malaria in Africa. And the great tragedy is that 3,000 children will die tomorrow from malaria in Africa. It just goes on. And there's about 35 million people living with the HIV virus at the moment in the world from the HIV pandemic. And we could go on. Infectious disease has been a major problem, is a major problem in many poorer parts of the world, and is becoming an increasing problem. Maybe just mention one more very problematic disease, MDR-TB, multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. Tuberculosis has always been a problem, is a problem now, and with the drug-resistant forms of tuberculosis, the situation's getting worse. So infectious disease, always been a problem. Now, it's interesting how you define infectious disease. And there was a guy called Robert Koch defined infectious disease way back in the 1890s. And what he said was that he formulated 4 postulates, actually, to determine whether a disease was infectious or not. And he said that the specific causative agent must be found in every case of the disease. So if someone's suffering from an infectious disease, and you look in that person, you should find the agent, that is usually the bacteria or the virus, which is causing that disease. And then he said the disease-causing organism must be capable of being isolated in pure culture. So if you take a bacteria out of an infected wound, or out of an infected bronchial passage, or out of an infected colon, whatever it is, and you culture that by putting a small number of the bacteria on a nutrient agar plate, or some sort of nutrient plate that the bacteria like to eat, then you should be able to culture them. You should be able to grow up the same organism by the billion on a culture plate. And then, if you inoculate a sample of the culture into a healthy subject, that should reproduce the disease. So you have a subject who's healthy, you put this bacteria that you've cultured back into them, back into a healthy subject, and that should cause the disease, indicating that it is the infectious bacteria which are causing the disease. And then the final postulate that Robert Koch put forward was that the disease organism must be recovered from the inoculated subject again, proving again that it was the bacteria which was causing the pathology. And Koch experimented on himself to demonstrate some of these postulates. And then later on in the late 1980s, probably early 1990s, around about 1990, there was an Australian doctor called Barry Marshall. And he said, look, I think that stomach ulcers, well, peptic ulcers anyway, duodenal and gastric ulcers, are caused by a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. I believe they are an infectious condition. And this was fairly revolutionary stuff at the time. And you know, he was pooh-poohed. He was put down by the establishment. Don't be ridiculous. Peptic ulcerations caused by stress or whatever theories were floating around at the time. How could it be caused by infection? But what Barry Marshall did was he went into the stomachs using endoscopes of people with peptic ulcer, took out some of the bacteria, eventually identified that these were the Helicobacter pylori bacteria, and he cultured them. He grew them in pure culture. And because no one would believe that the bacteria were causing the infection, what he did one day was he drank a load of the bacteria himself, and that immediately caused severe gastritis, and he went on to develop peptic ulceration, proving by reintroducing the bacterial culture into a healthy subject that the infection was caused by the Helicobacter pylori. But don't try it at home yourself. There's another fascinating story about one of these self-experimenters, a guy called John Hunter, who lived from 1728 to 1793, working mostly in London. He was a great English scientist and anatomist, and in fact he taught Edward Jenner, who we might learn about later. And John Hunter was the first to realise by systemic observation that inflammation is not a disease, but a feature of insulted tissue. But anyway, he thought the sexually transmitted diseases, the clap and the pox, were caused by a transmissible venereal poison. These days we'd call the clap gonorrhea and would call the pox syphilis, of course. And he actually thought that gonorrhea and syphilis were the same disease. So what he actually did was, in 1767, he acquired some infected pus from a patient with gonorrhea, with the clap. And I'm not quite sure whether he got this from a male or female patient, but he got the infected pus, and he inoculated himself with it. And of course he quickly developed signs and symptoms of gonorrhea. But then unfortunately later on he developed signs and symptoms of syphilis as well. And in his mind at the time, that made him think they were the same disease. You can kind of understand it, why he would think that. But he took the infectious agents, the pus from someone else, he put it onto himself, and he got the disease. Unfortunately, he wrongly thought that the two diseases were the same thing. And of course, the reason that happened was that the patient he took it from had been exposed to gonorrhea and to syphilis. And he did treat himself to some extent with local cautery and mercury. But he actually died in his 60s, probably of a complication of that syphilis, actually. So he took infected pus from someone with the disease, and he didn't culture it, but he reintroduced, he reproduced the disease by introducing the causative agent, by infecting himself with a causative agent. Now certainly do not try that one at home, or lots of people will be very cross with me.